we're coming here for the last day of painting this master copy. We've oiled this out now. I have put in a little glaze in a few areas here, and I can kind of show you how that was done. For example, let's see, where might I want to glaze in here? Trying to bring together a couple shapes. So, for example, maybe the hand area here. You know, it's a little brown, and maybe it needs to be a little more reddish, and then feed into the torso a little bit more. So I'll come in here with some oil and a pretty pure chroma, no white in here, and then just lay some color down over an area. And then I can even modulate this glaze a little bit. It doesn't have to be just a one color glaze. I can feed a little bit more color back into this here, and then pull it down. Taking a soft brush after that, and then just softening it out a little bit in here. Softening it out, pulling it down. Now the trick with the glaze, you have to remember not to add too much oil. If you get too much oil on here and your surface is too slick, then your glaze may start to bead up and it'll become uneven, kind of splotchy. So ideally we would want to use more transparent colors so that we wouldn't have to use too much oil. Now in a case like this, this is a limited palette painting. I'm not using any colors that are actually really transparent, so this particular painting is not ideally suited to be glazed. But we're just going to kind of work within the constraints of the limited palette. At this stage of the game, it's more important that we understand what range of color we can get in a limited palette, and then when we're going to execute our own work, you know, pull out, if we're going to glaze, pull out colors that are more suited to glaze, colors that are transparent. But for now, we'll just kind of work in over an area. This glaze will help to establish values that are a little closer together to help soften an area out, unifying a couple areas. Some artists would actually wait until the end of the painting and then just do a yellow glaze over the whole thing, which would unify the painting and then give it what they call a gallery glow, because paintings as they get older, you know, they get more yellow because of the oil, and as a result, you know, paintings in museums tend to take on this sort of yellowish look. So artists would actually try to emulate this by just doing a glaze over the whole painting when they were done, to get that gallery glow in there, make the painting look a little older and more historical. So I've gone around, I glazed a few areas. You know, I did glaze a little bit in the torso here, stomach to make it a little bluer. I glazed over here at the neck to soften this transition out a little bit. I glazed over here to sort of knock down a little bit of the red in there. So I got kind of as close as I could to what the color should be just by adding a few glazes here and there. You kind of think of a glaze as how we would veil in charcoal. You know, we stump our drawing. We get a light area and a dark area base established, and the shapes are good. It's just we use the veil to bring the values down, and in this case we use the color the same way to unify a couple areas or to bring the value and color down. We do have to keep in mind that a glaze does tend to lower the value of an area. So if you start out with something darker like this, you'll notice that as you glaze it, it does get continually lower in value. So there's some areas now that I'm going to have to go in and I'm going to have to push up the value a little bit, make it a little lighter in some areas, especially in the torso here, to start sculpting that out a little more. But I'll do that with the scumbling. You know, today's our last day on this, so it's, you know, figuring out a few glaze areas to bring some passages together, do some scumbling work to finish modeling everything, and then maybe putting in our last accents or details before we call it a day. So we're going to see how far we can get here. You know, I've started to add a little bit of the value in the background here to kind of pump some of this up a little bit. And as I do that, I'm, you know, staying on the side of my brush instead of just doing the dab, dab, dab. I want to really create the texture that I see in the reference here, and it's kind of a dry, brushy look, which looks like it's been created through the application of paint and then scraping and then paint and then scraping. We can sort of see how, on the reference, how textured the canvas was that was used, more so than the one I'm using here. So it looks like paint was probably worked into the surface and scraped down a little bit. But to compensate, I'm going to be working my brush on the side, doing a bit more of sort of a dragging effect, and trying to get a dry brushing effect on here to mimic some of those textures that I see. While also trying to hit the values in color. Now I'm going to start coming in, doing my last touch-ups to the shapes within the figure, and maybe doing a little bit of modeling to build up the form a little bit before I hit my final details. So the classic line I've indicated isn't quite correct. That's something that I feel like I need to touch up just a little bit. And I'm going to be thinking a little bit more about some of my brush work this time around. You know, the last couple sessions that we worked on this, it was really just throw the paint down, throw the paint down, throw the paint down, try to get the right color and value and roughly shape in there as close as we can, and then at the end of the day scrape it down to start to achieve this finish. But now what I'm doing is my final coat. I don't want to scrape it down after this. You don't scrape your painting the final day because it softens stuff out too much. So I have to think a little bit more when I'm adding this in. I have to make sure that these strokes that I'm putting in are the strokes that I want on the finish here. I'll be able to do some amount of softening, but I don't want to have to do too much blending or mushing about. I want to try and hit it pretty directly if I can. Pull out a brush for my darks in here so I can finish treating this classic line. It's a little dark. And for something like this, if I'm using just my ivory black, my yellow ochre, my red, if I lay a color down and it's not quite the right value, I will always try to alter it first with color. So in this case, it was a little too dark, so maybe I'll just have more cadmium red and yellow ochre in the mix with only a little bit of ivory black, and then see if I can get the right color by just using the two more predominantly. And if that doesn't work, I'll add a little black back in. I'll push them back and forth, and if I really can't get it to figure it out, and I really need more of a black influence in there, then maybe I will lighten it with white, but that's kind of my last resort for altering the value. Even in a limited palette like this. One of the dangers that students have with a limited palette is that they think it's sort of a free pass to use as much white as they want, and so ultimately they get all these colors really chalky and washed out, and it shouldn't be that way. White is still a very powerful, difficult color to be able to handle, and you don't want to just use it willy-nilly, lightheartedly. It's a little too light now. I'm actually gonna scrape it down back to what I had before. That's pretty close now. And I think I may actually have, even though it's my dark brush, I think I may have the tiniest bit of white on my brush. And it's just enough, even just a little speck of white is enough to reduce the richness and quality of my color. And I could have gotten that white in a lot of different ways. It could have been something as simple as the puddle that I dipped my brush into, the red or perhaps the black, had at one point a little bit of white deposited on the surface while I was pulling some other colors in, and that can be just enough that when you go back in to get a new color, it's going to contaminate this new mixture. So I'm trying to keep this, really white-free brush that may pick up just a little bit of white that was left over in one of the, maybe even the yellow ochre or something. And it's enough to have a very negative influence on my ability to mix really vibrant chromatic colors. So you have to be careful when you're mixing your colors. And a lot of times artists will, and I will sometimes as well, have lay out large puddles of color and then be very mindful to think, okay, well, if white's touching my brush, I'm only going to dip from the front side of this puddle. And if there's no white touching the brush, I can dip from the back side of the puddle. That way you don't cross-contaminate and get white in there. And people will do that also with their white puddle as well to maintain really high chroma. And that's a challenge for people too. When they go to use whites and put it into a mixture, well, if you've been dipping into your white a lot and you're dipping into an area of white that's not pure white and has maybe even the slightest bit of yellow or slightest bit of red in it, and you pull that into some mixture that you're trying to mix, well, all of a sudden you might not be able to get a really chromatic color anymore. So you need to really make sure that your white stays clean. And so for my white, I like to have a area that I'm pulling for my yellows, an area that I'm pulling for my blues, and then one's for my reds, so that it stays pretty clean. So when I go to make those really vibrant colors, I can, if I'm trying to make a vibrant yellow, I pull from the side of my white that's only touched yellow, so it's still going to remain really, really strong. But it's, that's a conscious effort you have to make. And what I notice with a lot of students is that they're just a little too mindless in dipping into the paint. They say, oh, I think I need white, so they just dip into the white and don't even think about where the brush is touching within the context of all that white. Whoa, that's way too dark. Since that underpainting is all dry, I can easily feel free to lift out any areas that I lay on this week that don't seem quite right. If I lay a color on and I miss it like that, I don't have to worry about removing those underlayers. If you notice that you've painted some things a little too warmly, there's this really nice effect with white, where if you take a color that is loaded with white, or even white itself, and rub it over an area, it'll work to create a real bluish haze. And I'm going to show you something like this on the arm, even though the arm isn't really needing this. If I just work a little bit of white paint in here, just right on here, and then I scrub it around, it will create this really bluish haze right over it. So I can cool off those. See how it makes it almost that purple on there. Just by scumbling a little bit of white on top of some red, I can now get something that looks very purple by comparison. So I can do that all these areas. Like that area I just added in the torso was really just white or yellow with a little bit of white, but laid on top of something so yellow and warm as it was, it can create something that looks bluish by comparison. And that's just a really simple scumble with some white. That's pretty relatively easy to do. Just trying to make it a little bit transparent. Titanium white like this is a very blue white. A lead white's a little warmer, but you can still do a lot of the similar things. And I'm almost just treating this kind of like a drawing right now, as opposed to a painting where I'm just laying on a little bit of pigment and then sort of almost just like shading it in, and then stepping back and seeing how it looks from a distance, seeing if I got the color a little closer or maybe I need to modify it a little more, see if I got the value about right. And if it ends up being wrong, it's a really easy fix. I just, take my paper towel, wipe it off, and then try again. I can do a lot more of this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth at this stage. Everything's set up, everything's pretty dry. And since I'm doing this mostly with, scumbles instead of body paint, I'm still getting a lot of texture in this flesh tone. So up close, it's still looking like pores, which is what I want. I don't want to lose that quality. But I'll lose it if I start to go too thick. But this is one of the things, looking at this painting ahead of time, that I wanted to make sure I decided on, was to not miss out on the textures of these fleshes in here, the flesh colors. You want something really blue, you just throw a little ivory black with some white in there. You do a little scumble, you'll get some really bluish notes. Trying to get a little closer with each mark. At this stage of the game too, it's something that I always encourage students when they start to get into this level of finishing, be it a drawing or a painting, is to encourage them to step back even more. So, today I am standing, despite the difficulty it makes with demonstration to have to stand, but it allows me to get back and see how all these little tiny changes might potentially be having an impact on the overall structure of the drawing or the painting here. I'm just going to try and get through this one last sort of pass of the torso, and then move into some detail work, even though there's still some areas and some color corrections that I would like to make. But for the sake of time, we're just going to get as close as we can with this and then just kind of move on to the last little detail aspect. I'm still not thinking right now in terms of detail. I'm still squinting down a lot. I'm still thinking in terms of shape and color and value. Trying to just build on top of what I have and quickly flick my eyes back and forth to see what the differences are between my drawing and, or my painting and the reference here. But still definitely not thinking detail yet. If I start to get really confused and really not being able to see the difference, I'll not only just squint or let my eyes go out of focus, but I'll also close one eye and let the other eye go out of focus and maybe squint a little bit, and then it starts to really get things really abstract, really prevent me from seeing any specific detail, and then I can jump into a little bit more refining of the overall shapes, the overall structure. That's where the accuracy is, it's that overall structure. Still too low over here. There we go. My shadow down here is a little low. I'll see if I can raise that up too. Let me get back up. If your color mixing skill becomes good, you can have a little more liberty to jump around while you're mixing and not have to be completely confined to one area. When I first started painting, my color mixing skill was not good. I just really had to struggle and muddle through it. You know, it took me a minute or a couple minutes to find each color that I was seeing and wanting to lay down, but I didn't give up. You know, I didn't just throw it down and then move on and not check it. You know, I'd really struggle to get each color in there. And since it took me so long to lock in and key into a color, I was afraid or too cautious to just willy-nilly jump around the canvas, because you know, I knew how much work it took to lock into an area and seek out that color. And if I had to do that for every single color I mixed, I would never get any paintings done. But if you can lock into one area, like this area, and locate the color, then you can use that color mixture that you used to easily figure out how to find an adjacent color. And then from there, find the next adjacent color, and so on and so forth. And so instead of, you know, spending 2 minutes here, and then 2 minutes here, and then 2 minutes here, and then 2 minutes here, because I'm responding to what I see is incorrect up there and wanting to fix it, by jumping around like that without the ability to quickly mix the color, I would just spend ages and ages mixing and mixing and mixing to get it right. Because I'll see as I'm working, or I would see as I'm working, that, you know, oh, I needed to fix that area up, I need to go back there and touch that up. But I would only do it if I knew I had enough time to mix into that area. Because I'm trying to get it as close as I can to being right the first time and then moving on. So I'll recognize that I may need to go back there, but I won't just keep jumping back and forth and jumping back and forth. And that's an issue that I see with students. You know, we always want to address the things that are incorrect on our canvas, and as a result, the students go towards the easiest thing to fix that they see. So, or easiest, most obvious thing that's incorrect, and that's the thing they'll target to fix, as opposed to just working in one area and trying to sort out the problems and then moving to another area. They'll execute a few strokes in one area and then it'll be harder and harder for them to see the next level of corrections that they need to do. And as a result, they sort of take the easy way out and say, well, you know, there's an obvious or a more obvious error over here, so I'm going to go ahead and address that now. And so then they jump into another area. And that's fine if you're willing to spend the time to get the color information right and the value information right and make sure it fits into the hierarchy of color and value that you've been setting up and establishing this whole time. But what I find is that students don't do that. They'll spend, you know, maybe 10 or 20 seconds mixing the color that they think is about right and then just throwing it on there, which is almost never correct. And so as a result, they now have made the area worse and are going to have to spend even more time correcting it, but they don't really know how to correct it, so they in turn just jump to another area, and the cycle continues on and on. And so it can be a sort of spiraling downward from there. And then a lot of students will say something like, oh, I overworked it, you know, meaning they shouldn't have gone back into the area to correct it. Well, there's no such thing as being overworked. You just haven't worked it correctly. Theoretically, if you're painting and using good painting practices, kind of like we've been trying to do for this whole painting here, then the more time you spend on a painting, the more finished it's going to be. Your goal is to be advancing the painting a little more each time, building on top of what you have. But you have to recognize that you have to work harder with each level you bring it up. You have to commit more time with each level you bring it up. Each level of finish and finesse that you do should take you and will take you more time to execute. So the payoffs might not be as big later on, but there's certainly no such thing as overworking. It just means that you've perhaps messed up a hierarchy relationship of values or colors that was good when you went back in and tried to adjust them in some way. You lost sight of your hierarchy. But it's definitely not something that's unfixable. You can always spend a little extra time and a little extra thought to make it more correct. I have to knock down some of these areas here. They don't necessarily need to be softened. I don't want to just soften them out, but I do want to kind of break up some of these transitions and feed one area into another. Sometimes that involves mixing a new color. Sometimes that involves just a scumble or even pushing some paint. But I don't want to be softening things out too much. I don't want to be mushing things around. As I raise the highlight here on this breast, I'm going to need to make sure that I go now and create a proper transition from light to dark. One of the things that students seem to have an issue with is realizing that they need to mix this transition. So they'll get a light side and a dark side, and then they'll just soften the two together. And you lose out on a lot of valuable color information that way. And in fact, it tends to make your colors a little bit more muddy and ultimately make things look pretty flat. So you have to make sure that you figure out what the actual color is as it moves from light into dark, and paint that color to give it the form as much ability to turn as you can give it. Keep in mind too, I'm not licking my canvas. I'm thoughtfully laying down the paint, and oftentimes going down and picking up a new color. Every little stroke or two. Another thing that students seem to have some issues with is that they always want to ride the side of their brush. They always want to put strokes in like this because the side of the brush is thinner than the broad side of the brush. So in effect, they're trying to get away with using a smaller brush in an area by just painting with the side of it. And it almost doesn't matter which brush they end up using. They'll do this for a big brush or a small brush. So essentially they're trying to downsize the size of their brush by several sizes. And what this does, first of all, it'll ruin your brush if you do it too much. Secondly, it won't distribute the paint as cleanly, and it'll end up being a little more scratchy and potentially remove layers of paint that's underneath. Also, you won't be able to get the nice soft on and soft off that creates a lot of the effects we're striving to achieve here. So I encourage students to work with the correct side of their brush, laying it down this way. If they need a finer point, they can always be using a filbert, because a filbert typically will come to a point, and you can utilize it to finesse some of the shapes a little bit more with that point, and even draw with it just a little bit. But a lot of bad effects, especially when working wet into wet, will occur if you're always riding the side of the brush. Ultimately, as I'm laying a lot of information down in here, I also have to consider that the value steps are minuscule, and sometimes there is no value step at all. But a lot of what I'm seeing up here on the reference is very, very subtle color shifting. And if I want to be able to describe all of the form and the three-dimensionality within the torso, I have to learn how to manipulate this color shifting to create all of the shapes in here, since everything is relatively a uniform value. Alright, now we're ready, I think, for some detail here. I am actually going to pull out a pretty small brush here, and we're going to try and zero in on some stuff. I'm going to pull up a chair. Sometimes I'll use a cane for this. I think I'll be okay without a cane here, just because the painting is so small and I can come in from an angle. And now I just need to begin manipulating some of these little tiny shapes in here. And this is where we're going to take this from being basically a really nice, strong, advanced block-in into hopefully what has the semblance of a more finished painting. Really hitting the tiny transitions between shapes. So for example, this cast shadow here, it's relatively soft as it bleeds into the rest of the torso, but instead of softening it out, I want to mix little color transitions here. I'm trying to knock down this kind of choppy look that I have between some of these colors, and I don't want to do that just by blending, because I'm using such intense color for the most part all around this figure, despite it being a limited palette, that if I just blend, this shape into this shape, I'm just going to get a muddy mess. And so I need to mix, figure out what is the color to mix for this intersecting shape. And that's a lot of work, and it's easy to see why students don't want to do it. It seems like it's a lot easier to just soften it on out. But you really have to resist that urge. Want to soften with the actual application of color. So I'm going to work around with my little brush here in the torso, and then I'll go into the darks, maybe put in the belly button, hopefully. At this stage too, you're deciding kind of now how close you want people to be when they look at your painting. Do you want it to look good from 10 feet away, or from 2 feet away, or do you want people to be 6 inches from your painting and still have it read as a strong illusion? And that's totally up to you. That ends up having nothing to do with the accuracy of the painting ultimately. That has to do with your own personal preference. If you're doing a master copy, I suggest that you try to, at least some degree, mimic the choices that the artist has made when it comes to the distance of something looking real. So for example, if you're going to copy something like a sergeant hand or something like that, in a photograph, when it's reduced down to a little tiny page, a sergeant hand looks very, very realistic. But if you try to paint it so that it looks that smooth and polished from 2 feet away, then you're going to really miss the point of doing a sergeant painting, because his whole thing was to give us the illusion that it's real even though it's painted so loosely. He's a very impressionistic painter. So you have to keep that in mind when you do your master copy. And I encourage you to select artists that you would like to emulate. If you want your paintings to look good from 2 feet away, don't do as many copies of Sargent as you would of someone like Bouguereau or something. Because there's going to be different choices they make in level of detail and rendering. Notice too, if I don't hit the color right every time. when I'm going to lay into an area. Like that last stroke I just made, it wasn't quite right. And I did one little stroke and I didn't see the immediate results I wanted. So instead of trying to push it and lick the canvas and work that paint color into it, like I see so many students do, I went right back down to my palette and loaded up with more paint, with a little bit different paint, and tried it again. And I'm still sort of fine-tuning it right now as I speak to get it just right. Instead of trying to force the color in there, I really just want it to set right on top. So if it's not setting right on top and being visible immediately, then it most likely means one of two things. Either A, I don't have enough paint on my brush when I went to lay it down, or alternatively, the color is not quite right. So my first thing I'll do is I'll go back down to the palette, make sure I did load it up, and check that. If I have loaded it up, then it's obvious that my color is wrong, and I need to mix more, mix a different color. One of the things students will do to kind of get around that is to just add more medium to their mixture, because the paint always flows easily off the brush if there's more medium. But there's a danger to that, especially in something like this. The paint might not adhere properly. Also, paint tends to take on a slightly different color when it's loaded with various mediums, so you need to keep that in mind. It also may dry a different color ultimately. Now I'm finally getting into what I would consider detail work, small little bits of information. Everything else up to this point has just been adjusting big shapes, adjusting big shapes. And this is how I'll think about even my portraits, my big paintings that I do if I'm doing a life-size head or a little larger than life-size head. I'll be working these big main shapes first. That's my big concern. I'll start with this big giant brush, lay in some big basic areas, and then slowly refine it more and more and more until finally at the end of it, when I can't put it off any longer, I'm working with this tiny brush to put in some of my final accents and details. When I go to load my brush, I know you can't see my palette, but what I'm doing, I pick up a color and I twirl my brush around, especially if this is a round, comes to a point, so I twirl it around to really load all of that pigment up into the brush there. Even though I may only be doing one stroke with it, may only put off a little tiny bit of paint with it, I still want to completely saturate my brush. So that way when I do lay a color down, it comes off really nice and easily. I don't want to have to fight my paint. I'm going to carve that back wall. Getting a little closer here. It's my last chance to fine tune all these shapes here. Some areas like here to here, the shadow to light, it's just not transitioned at all. You know, my brushes before were a little too large, so now I'm going in with this small brush, trying to lay down some paint, work that dark side into the light side. Now there's lots of ways to describe this approach to painting, as far as, you know, rendering out large information first and working your way to big information. And everyone's got their own way to describe it. You know, I used to tell students, you know, stand 10 feet away, and when it looks good from 10 feet away, stand 6 feet away, and when it looks good from 6 feet away, stand 3 feet away, and then when that looks good, stand 2 feet away, or whatever. And that forces you to deal with larger issues, general issues first, before you start struggling with little details, and it helps you keep and maintain the overall hierarchy of the painting. Other artists, I think like Schmid, will say, start off by squinting way down at your painting the whole time, and then as your painting starts to get developed a little more, you can open your eyes and squint a little less, and then squint a little less, and then squint a little less, until at the very end of the painting you can paint it with your eyes open to put in your final accents. And you know, that is how I painted for a long time, and it still works too. I still paint that way. You know, other artists will say, you know, paint as though you're viewing it from, you know, however far away, so you can barely see it. Just work the big shapes first, or use the large brush first. You know, start with a 2-inch brush, model as much as you can, then do a 1-inch brush, model as much as you can, then do a 1/2-inch brush, model as much as you can, and just slowly work your way down to a smaller and smaller brush. All of these are basically essentially designed to instruct the student in one thing: to work the large shapes to big shapes, to work the general overall idea, the big color relationships, the big value relationships, and the big shape relationships, before you start noodling with too much detail, because it's easy to get sucked into too much detail. Our eyes, if we stare at something too long, will over-exaggerate the value range, will over-exaggerate the color range, and so you'll put information in, and you'll make choices that are outside of the appropriate hierarchy of color and value. And so we have to come up with all these little tricks to fool ourselves outside of our normal way of perception, what we would call like continual adjusting, or continual focusing the human eye can do. This belly button in, I think we'll be about done here. Now, even though we only have in class, I think a total of 8 hours on this assignment, 4 sessions times 2 hours. It's not a lot of time at all to be doing something this complex, and so you really are going to need to focus in on one area and flush out one area like this as best you can. Try to get all the way through the stages of painting in the amount of time we have. But I'm going to encourage you to go home and finish these. And you know, the final assignment for this class is to do a master copy on your own. And you know, when you turn it in, we are looking that you got close colors. It doesn't have to be super exact, but we want it to be close enough. And by close enough, we would say look like something that the artist could potentially have executed as far as colors go. You know, some artists don't use just the standard fleshy pink colors for skin tone, and so if you do a master copy and you use those colors to render it out, it's not going to look correct. It's not going to look like the artist could have done it or would have done it. And so that has to be your guiding principle for all this. You are doing a master copy, but you shouldn't just look at the one master copy. You should look at many examples by that artist to get an understanding of how they're executing their paintings. And then from that, try to execute a copy of one of their paintings using all of the technical insight you've gained from everything else. So what you do, hopefully, will transcend beyond just a mere copy or a poor copy, and become something that it looks where it looks like you're making some of the same choices that the artist would have made when they're painting. That's ultimately the whole point of a master copy. You're not doing a master copy to try and get a pretty picture of the artist. You're doing a master copy to learn how to make the choices that the artist themselves made. And so if your painting does not reflect that, then you don't receive a passing mark. It's not an easy task. And I encourage you to not be seduced by the alla prima painters too much. You know, if you have an interest in alla prima painting, that's good, but keep in mind that if you're doing a master copy of an alla prima painting, or even a direct painting, it should be painted relatively direct. People who try to do alla prima or direct paintings over multiple sessions, they lose a lot of the quality and the character of a direct or alla prima painting. And thus you may have a superficial replication of the painting, but it won't have the same qualities that we're trying to emulate. All right, we'll soften some last edges. I need to knock down one little piece of green that ended up being a little too strong here. Squinting at your painting will help you, or at least relaxing your eye at your painting, will help you to discover where some edges may have been placed a little bit harder. So you can knock some of those down. When your eyes are opened, they're going to be bombarded with color and value information, so you might miss some of these more subtle edges. But squinting down will help you see where some are just popping out a little too much. All right, we'll leave it, I think, right there.